on C-SPAN 2. Coming up at 9 p.m. Eastern. Coming of age during the Iranian Revolution. Then the Great Game. Former CIA officer Frederick Hitz separates myth from reality in the life of an agent. Next weekend on Book TV, Encore Book Notes with Kenneth Ackerman, who looks at James Garfield's presidency and murder in Dark Horse. After that, on Public Lives, a new biography of Ulysses S. Grant from Josiah Bunting. And on History on Book TV, Todd Tucker examines the 1924 confrontation between Notre Dame students and members of the Ku Klux Klan. Journey from the Land of No is a new memoir on life as a young woman in revolutionary Iran. This program is an hour.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to R.J. Julia Booksellers in beautiful downtown Madison, Connecticut. This year, poet, film producer, and documentarian Roya Hakakian published her memoir of growing up in pre-revolutionary Tehran as the beloved and cosseted youngest child and only daughter in an extended, prosperous Jewish family. She spins stories of a golden age, not so far distant, in which Jews and Muslims shared their beloved city harmoniously. Here's the story most of us never dreamt existed: a thriving Jewish population in the heart of Tehran, the revolution that destroyed its vibrancy, and its aftermath. So I would like to introduce Roya Hakakian.
Thank you so much for coming. I want to first and foremost thank the legendary R.J. Julia Bookstore for arranging this reading, and then all of you for coming, because I don't just read books, I live with books, and I think every one of you who ever invests in the time and the effort to read a book deserves my heartfelt gratitude. I'm truly blessed that you're here tonight. Thank you. Tonight I have tried to piece together 3 separate vignettes from the book. I thought it would be reading one big chunk wouldn't really give you a sense of the whole book. So I have picked 3 different parts from 3 different portions within the book, and hopefully that way you'll have a better sense of how the whole story comes together. In January of 2002, I signed a contract to write my memoir of growing up a Jewish teenage girl in post-revolutionary Iran. And for the next few months, I became a perfect insomniac. The truth is that I found myself a ghastly subject about which to write. How awfully dull to be writing about myself. But after many nights of analyzing the ceiling in my bedroom, I slowly began to see my story as the story of Iran itself. Not Iran as it is today, but how it came to be the place that it is today. So inevitably, this is a story of a generation, educated, urban, secular Iranians whose voices have been hushed for nearly 25 years. Just as inevitably, this is also the story of Iranian women, just as it is the story of the most ancient and vibrant Jewish communities in the world. Jews lived in Iran far before Islam ever came to Iran. If we understand this Iran, we understand much of what is plaguing our world today. In the history of Iran of the last quarter century, each one of our questions simply finds an answer. What are the roots of the hostility against the United States? How did political Islam become an overt movement? And is there hope that the region will abandon its dream of Islamic theocracy? Look closely at contemporary Iran, and you will find everything you're hoping to know. To manage my own aversion toward writing a memoir, I carved out a very focused scope. This book doesn't begin with the day I was born. Oh, thank you, Lord. It begins in 1975, just before a relatively modern country, one of the greatest oil producers in the world, where women dressed just like you and me lived under the rule of the Pahlavi dynasty. I'll read from the first portion of the book, then we can have our usual Q&A. My family was a middle-class Jewish family, and we lived in a trendy, eclectic neighborhood in an alley that, believe it or not, was called the Alley of the Distinguished. And as I mentioned, this is the Iran of 1970s, Tehran of 1970s. My father was a poet and a school principal, and very much respected in the community. I'll give you sort of a window into that early life. Being one of father's own was an honor and a burden. People saw us as his ambassadors and expected us to show just the right blend of faith, intellect, and mastery of rhetoric, and the ability to rhyme on demand. Each compliment showered on us, in reality, was an expectation indirectly declared. As the youngest Hakakian and the only girl, I inspired little hope and drew prayers to reverse my precociousness. Inshallah, God willing. My brother Bez, who was 5 years my senior and born in the same year as the crown prince, was believed to be the brightest, most erudite, and congenial among his classmates. The only fair-haired child in a family of brunettes, we believed him to be better looking than others his age, even his royal counterpart. Mashallah, may God protect him. My brother Javid was exceptionally handsome, but no one dared say that to his face, for he, a fierce debater, would surely find it a most superficial comment. At only 17, he was among the few young men who headed the Jewish Iranian student organization. Mashallah, mashallah. 2 weeks after a phone line, the easy-to-remember 891-444, was installed in our house, we all came to the conclusion that it was Javid's private line that we had just installed. Invite Hemingway to the Hakakians for a day, my brother Bez used to say, and he'd never again wonder for whom the bell tolls. Sometimes father expressed his irritation in the reminder that the telephone line was to be used only in emergencies. Otherwise, why would Alexander Graham Bell bother to call his assistant just to say, "Watson, come here, I want you," and hang up? One line is all that should be exchanged on the phone. Hi, we're healthy, goodbye. But even our household of stars had only one genius. Only one shouldered the burden of being the firstborn, fulfilled everyone's highest expectations, and then went on to impress others, those others who are tough to please. Only one child had the approval of Queen Sarah, her signed letter congratulating him on winning first place in a national drawing contest. Only one of us made the record for being the youngest cartoonist at 19 on the editorial board of Iran's leading satire magazine, Tawfiq, the first to put the Hakakian name in bold-face print, Albert, 1,000 mashallahs. Albert's exuberance alone populated our house, his sketches strewn about pens, books, brushes, and easels aside. In his spare time, when he was not finishing a commissioned piece or studying to skip a grade, he breathed life into whatever he touched. After he painted our outhouse in Art Deco style and added a Mad magazine rack on the back wall, pissing became the family's favorite sport. If any of us wanted to take a picture, we asked our subject to say cheese, not Albert. He had us name a slew of dairy products until we struck what he considered a truly original pose. I understood Albert best by watching him. The callus on the side of his right middle finger, the ink stains on his delicate hands, his tender features, square jaw, and shiny, straight hair, amounted to a seraphic presence despite his beat-up overalls. Even a grocery list in his handwriting looked like a piece of calligraphy and was hard to throw away, and the photograph on his university ID, which looked no less radiant next to the gold royal seal. Name, Albert Hakakian. Place of birth, Iran. ID number, 264. Year, freshman. Campus, the Academy of Visual Arts. Year of attendance, 1974. That was 1 year before he left for America, before he flew right out one day and left our family portrait, a grin with a missing tooth. This was family. And my brother left. At that year, I was only 9 years old because he had become sympathetic to anti-government underground groups that were on his university campus. There were very few civil liberties and no freedom of press in Iran in that time. And my father became very concerned that Iran's equivalent of KGB, called SAVAK, could cause trouble for Albert. And so he sent him away to America. This was my very first encounter with the realities of political life in Iran, with the way freedom really didn't exist. And it was a mysterious situation. It wasn't that anybody really spoke to me and told me that this is why he's going, but just the mystery shrouded his departure, and I knew something was awry. 3 years later, those underground groups had taken to the streets and were demonstrating in broad daylight, no longer underground. From exile in Paris, Ayatollah Khomeini, whom people nicknamed Agha, was sending messages to people in Iran to demonstrate against the regime and the king of Iran. One of his most ingenious orders came weeks before the regime fell. He asked that all Iranians turn off their lights in their homes, go to the rooftops and shout, "God is great," or "Allahu Akbar." My best friend in the neighborhood, a Muslim girl named Z, joins her family on the rooftop. This is the story of those 10 minutes, and the night everybody went to the rooftop to shout, "God is great." And by the way, it had to happen between 9 and 9:15, and it happened for many nights. At 8:45 p.m., the lights in the homes began to go off one by one. By 8:55, not even the night was as dark as our neighborhood. All but the heavenly bodies had heeded Agha's message. Under the full moon, the antennas and the tin chimneys emanated a silvery glow, enhancing the majesty of the dark. Nothing hung from the clotheslines, not even pins. The neighbors were on balconies and rooftops, even those with no intention to chant. And that was just what Agha did. He dazzled even his enemies by the power of his spectacles. Darkness had rendered all faces immaterial. The eye could only see the outlines of the crowd, some short, others tall, some hunched, a few seated. Those were the cynics waiting to see if the night could compel them to join. For the first time since I knew Z, her family had come together in one place. Great uncle next to Mrs. Banu, who stood beside her husband, each holding one of the twins. Z's brothers tossed a rock in their hands. Bibi rested an arm on Z's shoulder. This was Agha's first miracle, a family united. And my family? I hopped over the dividers between the rooftops and joined my parents. Father was repeating under his breath, "Helen, do you see this? For as long as the eye can see. One stinking mullah can do all this?" To commit what was memorable to mind, Father always needed Mother as a witness. "Shh," she elbowed him. He teased her. "Try to say Allahu Akbar, Helen, or we would chance irking the goyim." Could I say Allahu Akbar? The words echoed in my mind, but I could not utter them. "Say it," I urged myself. 1, 2, 3. But I could not. I had never had to say words in Arabic, to chant in a language other than my native Persian. I had never been expected to sound like a Muslim. Must I choose? My heart was fluttering in my chest and everywhere else. Excitement pulsated in my ears. It throbbed in my belly. I feared something unknown. I was brimming with the thrill of something unknown. My parents were scared, whereas no one around us seemed to be. Z signaled me from the distance, inviting me to join her family, and I found myself torn between staying on our rooftop or going to hers. Suddenly, I envied Z, who was standing among her siblings. I envied their togetherness, their certainty, their eager anticipation for 9 o'clock to strike. At 8:57 p.m., 2 rocks struck the light poles at the end of the alley. The skitter of the shards against the asphalt in an alley so hushed sounded as if 1,000 glass bottles had shattered. No one said a word. At 8:58, the alley of the distinguished stretched like a common alley, dark and desolate. But at 9, it came to life. Moans of Allahu Akbar billowed through the night. They were not orchestrated sounds, but fitful, scattered through the alley. They rose as if every person's throat had been clutched. Their chests heaved with each breath. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Each Allah expanded in the windpipes, inhaling air as if it were rapidly running out. For every gasp, 1,000 more echoed in sympathy. The Allahs drawled longer with each chant, H's barely fading under the Akbars, until all fizzled into a single Allah, greatness slowly sundering, then dissipating in the intoxicated throats. The cloud of a single plea plumed over the alley. By 9:08, the plea was a desperation reverberating in his name. Allah, and not another word. Allah, and it sealed all the untold. Every home a heap of kindling, the alley was a bonfire. Phantom flames had scorched the neighborhood. A thick, sonorous smoke hovered over every home. Every man, every woman, every child was burning. Everyone a victim. Everyone an arsonist. So this happened just a few weeks before the revolution. And probably in December of 1978. And by February of 1979, two things had happened. Ayatollah Khomeini had returned to Iran, and obviously the Shah had left. And he was probably traveling between the United States and Egypt, because no country at that point was accepting him. And I, along with the rest of my generation, we were ecstatic. You know, we were kids, and the streets were euphoric. Everybody was really delighted. This was like a big rock concert where everybody had a backstage pass and no one was going home. So it was the most wonderful time of our life, and the street, every alley, every street corner was just ebullient with the kind of energy that none of us have ever known since then. I was going to a Jewish school in that year, and it didn't really matter. We were no less excited and no less energetic by everything that had happened. But one exception occurred only in our school, which was about 6 months after the revolution. All of a sudden, a woman in a black veil arrived at our school and said that she was going to be our principal. Well, it was a little odd. We were Jewish girls in a Jewish school, and we had never had a black woman. First of all, we hardly ever met people dressed that way. Second of all, why would she be our principal? Anyway, she appointed herself the principal, and I think it was an early sign that we as kids failed to read. And somehow her mission was to kindly convert us and convince us that we should all become Muslim children. And most interestingly, her obsession wasn't with God or praying or even the Prophet. It was exclusively with two things: hair and nudity. She believed that if a little bit of a hair showed, everybody, it would begin the kind of trouble that none of us can even fathom. I'm going to read you my own recollections that I have composed in this book of one of her very last speeches, one of the speeches that she gave us. So you have to imagine I'm all wrapped up in a black veil, and you can barely see anything but eyes and nose. My dear sisters, daughters of our great revolution, it is now time for you to learn about the delicious topic of corporeal sin. Yes, my sisters, young and innocent as you are in your pubescent splendor, you're also diabolical and no less. Duty compels me to warn you of the perniciousness that you all possess. You do possess it, and you don't even know it. Abomination lurks beneath your innocence. Oh, how loathsome it is. how lethal, more baneful than the hatchet of the Satan himself. Oh, my sisters, I walk on hot coals, throw myself in the way of eternal whirlwinds, die before I allow you to let loose, unknowing as you are, the evil, the apocalypse that only you can bring upon us. You are certainly wondering how on earth you are capable of drowning everything in eternal darkness. You are asking yourselves of what apocalypse is our beloved principal speaking? Ah, but I tell you, I speak of the apocalypse of your hair. Yes, hair. Such a simple word, so seemingly dead and blameless. But my dear girls, blameless it is not. It is constantly scheming to reveal itself, peeking out of the scarf, even from under the veil. It peeks not to reveal itself to you or me, or your peers in this room, but to a man. You heard me right. Your long, beautiful hair is the snake that deceived Eve, who then deceived Adam. That vile reptile never stopped. Hundreds of years later, it still deceives. One glance at your hair, even at one strand of your hair, is enough to turn any man into an irredeemable wanton, into a unicorn beast with a unicorn intention, each of his heinous tissues in unanimity into its projectile moving in a unified direction, that of sin. Once the beast unleashes itself upon your innocence, you are not the child of Allah anymore. You are a child of Satan, and appropriate to your kinship, you deserve to receive a hail of stones and nothing less. You ask yourself, how does our sister, our mother and advisor, wish us to behave? By now you fully understand what evil I speak of. I shall spare you the obscene, but it is, I'm afraid, up to me to teach you how to avoid it. If a man walks into this hall at this very moment that I stand before you with my veil, what must I do? You look at me and say, Mrs. Mohaddam is covered from head to toe. We can't see a strand of her hair. Even now that my scarf is pulled to the edge of my eyebrows and its trail covers my neck, even now that my long sleeves reach my knuckles and my uniform touches my ankles, even now, my sisters, daughters of our glorious revolution, that my pants fall to the heel of my shoe and my shoes leave not a centimeter, even a millimeter of skin exposed, even now I feel naked. You heard me right. Naked if a man were to walk in. In the West, in that superficial, artificial, morally corrupt country called America, where they know not of God, where they live by the rules of Satan, where they drink alcohol instead of water, consume an animal as filthy as pig, and lead promiscuous lives, where women walk naked in the streets, fornicate in public, and conduct orgies in their homes, there the headmasters train their students for insignificant trials for an emergency such as fire. They conduct fire drills in their schools. But we, my sisters, daughters of our great revolution, we are not afraid of earthly threats. We fear only one fire, the eternal fire of hell. So the drill that I'm preparing you for is a man drill. Learn this and you've bought yourselves a one-way ticket out of hell. If a man were to walk into this room, I, naked as I feel without my veil, would have no choice but to put the end of my Islamic uniform over my head. And you say to yourselves, but Mrs. Mohaddam would be exposing her body. But at that moment of emergency, when I have not even a second to lose, I must cover my head better than any other part. So girls, if I scream, man, 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 what must you do? Run if you can, and if you can't hide, and if you can't hide, surrender and pull the end of your uniforms over your heads. Good education, no? So we did laugh at this during that year because it seemed like such an oddity. It was the one thing we had never seen. Everybody else on the streets looked still the same. We were dressed this way, so she just looked like a nut, and no one really took her seriously. Except that in retrospect, now we look and we see that this was part of a bigger bigger encroachment on Iran, on civil liberties, on the status of women. By 1982, what's called the Islamic dress code, and that is the kind of dress code where you have to wear a scarf. If you're not wearing a black veil, and women who had never worn a black veil didn't know how to hold one, believe me, it's not easy to walk with this thing. You can trip yourself, and it's a messy business. So if you don't know how to hold it, you're going to go for plan B, which is put on a scarf, put on a uniform, which very much looks like a bad raincoat, and wear a pair of pants underneath, and socks and shoes and everything, so you don't expose anything. By 82, the Islamic dress code had been enforced, and that's what all women, including myself, had to wear. And it has become by then more and more clear that the religious forces have taken the affairs of the country into their own hands. But I, along with a group that called ourselves the Dreamers, we were a group of secular Jewish students who still believed that there was hope for Iran, for its revolution to go into that democratic direction, and that we still believe that everything that had happened was just a bad accident, and perhaps it could be redirected to go in this other way that we had wished. One of the things that we used to do was we used to all get together on Friday mornings, and we were about a dozen or more boys and girls, and we all went to North Tehran, which is the site of Alborz Mountains, and we used to go up and hike. Our parents didn't like it, but we did it anyway. This is the scene of one of our last hikes. And we have gone about half a day, and we've decided to rest at a shelter. We pranced around the shelter grounds. At those great heights, in our rocky sanctuary, we suspended the Islamic dress code. The girls unbuttoned their uniforms and walked about with their scarves loosely around their heads. Nazila had found her way to a stream and was standing on a rock, barefoot once again, washing, praising the freshness of the water, but mostly scanning other climbers. She was the only one among us who did not hide her desire for boys. "How's the weather, Nazila?" I shouted to her. Weather was code for the status of the attractiveness of the male climbers in her eyeshot. She crinkled her nose and narrowed her eyes. The forecast was dull. Her disappointment softened my heart. She desperately needed to be amused, or she would turn restless. So I called to her again, touched up my scarf when she looked my way, and said, "Nazila, I hate to break the news to you, but you have developed a neurotic tic. Maybe you should quit hiking for a while." She touched up her scarf and asked, "What tic?" I raised my hand and touched the side of my scarf and answered, "That! You just did it again." She had touched the side of her scarf once more. "There's hope for people like you, Nazila. Medication can help." "What the hell are you talking about?" Oblivious to my lark, she had mimicked me every time I had tugged at my scarf. Watching someone fix her scarf in public was as infectious as yawning. Soon everyone was doing it. And after a few rounds, having gotten Nazila to fix her scarf with her wet hands, it was now damp through and through. Finally, catching on, she darted out of the stream and charged at me. We were tangled in horseplay, which must have seemed like a tussle to Ellie. She came over to intervene. "Don't fight," Nazila said. "The Alborz isn't big enough for this giraffe and me." I threw her a kick. Ellie wedged herself between us. "But see, there's good reason why you have such strong disagreements." Nazila was listening. I lunged, this time at Ellie. One hand at my waist, I targeted her heart with my walking stick in my other hand and declared, "Speak or take thy last breath." Unprepared to parry, she fell to her knees and begged, "Disagreement, my lord, is only natural among the lettered. If I may be allowed to quote our father of modern poetry, the ignorant are harmonious. Only storm spawns discordant children." "A verse by Ahmad Shamlu, my lord, your most beloved of poets." Will you now spare my life? Ellie, I bowed, put my sword back in the sheath. Under my arm had to do. Thou art the fairest in all of Alborzistan. By now Nazila was leaning against a rock, and with a twig she was drawing her name in dirt. We had come together in a circle, quiet with contentment. This was the moment that made all the troubles, the early rise out of bed, the trudge up the trail, all worthwhile. Below us the city, the homes with our parents in them, looked shrunken with sleep. But the tingle in our skin, the buzz in our muscles, the floating sensations in our heads signaled the flow of wakefulness at its best in us. Our motley bundles of cheese, olives, breads, herbs, and fruits made the rounds, and the inevitable was about to begin. First the joint singing of a few folk songs, then reciting poetry. Along with the food, the canteen, and the extra socks, we always packed a few pages of reading material, a poem, a song, sometimes an anti-war leaflet that had been slipped to the university students among us. Carrying those few pages made us feel we still had some freedom, we still had some privacy left to us, and could carry what we wished in our bags. Azar seized the opportunity. I dare anyone to rise to a declamation match of Furugh Farrokhzad, the mother of our modern poetry. Let's hear it, everyone. There was a round of clapping hands. Allow me, I bound once again, then tapped on one end of my walking stick, held it in front of my mouth, testing, 1, 2, 3, and began. I know a sad little fairy who lives in an ocean, and ever so softly plays her heart into a wooden flute. A sad little fairy who dies with one kiss each night and is reborn with one kiss each dawn. Farifte interjected. Get lost! Every schoolgirl knows this one. Waving a new edition of Furugh's poetry in the air, Azar said, Let me read to you, my dear plebeians, from here. It's the newest edition. The gazes were fixed on Azar as she skimmed the lines for a few moments, and in a puzzled tone finally said, Either I've gone crazy or this is a defective copy. Why don't you just read? Well, it's missing words. She brought the book close to her eyes and strained to read a random stanza aloud. One can shout in the fakest tone, in all insincerity, I love you. One can lie in a lover's embrace with two big hard ... Hey, what do you mean ... Exasperated, Azar said, Well, exactly. The words are missing. I've bought a defective copy. Nazila was fully engaged at last. Well, let's fill in the blanks, shall we? 2 boobs, 2 buns, 2 balls. Somebody, please stop the advance of Nazila's imagination here. Eddie took the book and carefully leafed through the pages. In a few seconds, his eyes had a look of eureka in them. He silenced everyone and announced, Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the new era of censorship, Ayatollah style. The book was now in my hand, and Eddie was right. It had been censored. In every poem there were words missing. Cyrus reached for his backpack to examine his own copy, but just as he was about to speak, a strange voice interrupted. Don't you know the mountain is closed today? A teenager in army fatigues said as he leaped and landed on a rock above us. In his left hand he held a Kalashnikov. He placed one foot a little higher and rested the end of his rifle on his thigh, the final touch to the pose of one in command. Cyrus found the courage to speak. He explained that we had indeed seen a sign, but ignored it. You see, sir, Cyrus addressed the teenager, the closing of the mountain was unprecedented. Unprecedented was the wrong word, because the young man reached for his walkie-talkie and dispatched additional backup. Unprecedented, he said, belonged to the pre-revolutionary era. These are new times. The revolution was making its own precedents. Anything was possible now, even shutting down the Alborz, if that's what Agha wanted or the revolution needed. According to the needs of his revolution, Alborz could be shut down if necessary. According to ours, It was unthinkable. Within minutes, 3 men arrived. They knew the trails well and reached us quickly. They moved over the rocks better than gazelles. Though they were far fewer than us, their casual conduct, their erect postures in their uniforms, the ease with which they held their guns in one hand as if they were holding walking sticks, the way the noise from their walkie-talkies filled the vast open air, made us feel surrounded by a battalion. In the heart of our republic, in our sanctuary, on the rocks of the great Alborz, we had become captives. Thank you for listening.